Okay, let's dive right into it. Think about how we picture addiction today.
Hmm.
Maybe it's the news, the opioid crisis,
Mm.
fentanyl, or maybe it's closer to home, someone glued to their phone, just lost in the scroll.
Yeah, we all see it.
We know addiction's a huge challenge, right? But what if the way we're looking at it is fundamentally, well, missing the point?
Go on.
What if it's not just about the drug or the screen or whatever the behavior is? What if it's something much deeper inside us and, inside society itself?
That's exactly the core idea we're unpacking in this deep dive. We've been digging into this really critical piece of material. It's titled The Collapse of Connection: How Digital Isolation, Trauma, and Economic Despair Are Driving the New Addiction Epidemic.
And our mission here really is to wrestle with the central argument in the source material because it kind of flips the script on how we usually think about addiction.
Right. Not just a chemical thing, not just a moral failing.
Exactly. Instead, it makes this compelling case that addiction at its heart is, well, it's an act of escape. It's a response to pain, and it's a symptom of this profound disconnection.
Yeah, the source argues that this huge wave of addiction we're seeing now, and that includes substances and behaviors, right?
Yeah.
It isn't just random.
No.
It's being fueled by these deep, interconnected cultural and societal wounds. Things like unresolved trauma, the isolation that, weirdly, our super-connected digital lives seem to make worse,
Hmm.
and just the sheer crushing weight of economic despair that so many people are facing.
What I find really provocative about this source, it's the assertion that our current ways of dealing with addiction, the systems, the approaches, they're falling short.
Because they're treating symptoms.
Right. They're designed to manage the surface stuff, not get at these root causes. And it forces you, the listener, to pause and think.
Yeah.
Okay, if addiction comes from disconnection and pain, what could its true opposite actually be?
So to start unpacking this, the source takes us back a bit. It challenges that common idea of addiction as just a modern crisis, defined by today's headlines.
Yeah, and it does that by reminding us that, look, humans have always sought ways to escape pain. This isn't new.
Not at all.
We're talking ancient history like fermented honey mead for altered states, right? Then 19th century opium dens, the crack epidemic in the 80s. This search for escape, it's a thread running through the whole human story.
And what's really fascinating is how the source suggests that surges in addiction often mirror society's deepest wounds.
How so?
Well, think about periods of intense war or widespread poverty, systemic racism, collective grief. When those things peak, the source argues, you see a corresponding rise in the need to numb out, to escape through substances. It really powerfully frames addiction not as a moral failing, but as a response.
We've definitely seen the perception of addiction shift over time, haven't we?
Oh, absolutely.
From being seen as a crime, a sin,
Hmm.
the shame around drunkards or junkies towards the disease model.
Which AA helped popularize, yeah.
And that shift was crucial, right? Helped destigmatize it, seeing it as an illness.
It was a huge step forward, and the source acknowledges that.
Yeah.
But it also argues that even the disease model sometimes doesn't go deep enough,
Okay.
because it can end up framing addiction mainly as like a medical issue or a brain problem,
Uh-huh.
and maybe inadvertently overlooks the environmental, the emotional, even the spiritual wounds that are actually driving the behavior in the first place.
And that's where that really powerful question comes in, the one the source references from Dr. Gabor Mate.
Yeah.
Don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain.
Mm.
And this material makes a really strong case that what we're seeing today, this massive surge, it's not just substances, it's behavioral compulsions too. Screens, sex, shopping, self-harm, even workaholism,
All of it.
all of it. And the source sees us as separate things, but as a collective signal, like a widespread cultural cry for help that echoes all that underlying pain. Okay, so if pain is the root, according to this source, where does that pain often start? This deep dive points very clearly towards childhood trauma, calls it a foundational wound.
Yes, exactly. It argues addiction doesn't start with the first drink or the first drug. It starts with an earlier one.
Mm-hmm.
And for millions, that wound happens in childhood. The source talks a lot about the ACE study.
The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study,
Right.
that was landmark research.
Huge.
The one that showed that clear link between bad experiences early in life, like abuse, neglect, or growing up with dysfunction, like addiction or mental illness in the house,
Mm.
and a much higher risk of addiction, mental health problems, even chronic diseases later on.
And what's sort of terrifyingly simple about the ACE findings, as highlighted here, is just how direct that correlation is. The more ACEs, the more trauma someone carries from childhood.
The more likely they are to seek numbness.
Statistically, yes.
Yeah.
As adults, they're more likely to seek some kind of escape.
And there's actual neuroscience behind this too, which the source gets into. Early trauma doesn't just leave emotional scars, it physically shapes how the brain develops.
Exactly. If a child's environment is constantly threatening or unpredictable, their nervous system gets wired for survival mode. Fight, flight, freeze.
Yeah.
Instead of wiring for feeling safe, regulated, connected. So the prefrontal cortex, the part you need for managing emotions, impulse control, planning it, might not develop as strongly.
Right.
Meanwhile, the amygdala, the brain's threat detector, it stays on high alert, hypervigilant.
So the brain's default setting isn't connection or pleasure, it's survival. Surviving pain.
That's the critical insight this source really hammers home.
Yeah.
And when that pain gets too much to bear, addiction offers this powerful, immediate, but ultimately destructive way to get temporary relief.
There's a line in the source you mentioned that just hits hard.
For many, drugs are not about getting high. They are about feeling okay for 5 minutes.
Yeah, that reframes everything, doesn't it?
Good point.
It makes the case, like the source says, that trauma-informed care isn't just, a nice idea. It's absolutely essential for tackling addiction. You can't help someone find a way out if you don't understand the sheer pain they're running from.
Okay, so let's shift now. We've talked about the internal wound, the trauma.
Yeah.
Let's look at a major external force the source highlights. Digital disconnection.
The paradox.
Exactly, the paradox of our times, right? Never more technologically connected, yet we're seeing these alarming levels of deep loneliness.
It feels so true. You look at social media, it promised community, connection.
That was the dream.
But the source argues the reality is often comparison, performance, and ultimately, deeper disconnection. We put these curated versions of ourselves out there
The highlight reel.
while often hiding real suffering behind the screen. We end up chasing likes when what we actually crave is real love, real belonging.
And this material points to studies, lots of them, linking heavy screen time, especially intense social media use, to way higher rates of depression, anxiety, even suicidal thoughts, particularly worrying trends among young people.
And here's where it gets really insidious, right? The source talks about how the design of these platforms actually mimics addiction.
Oh, absolutely. They are quite intentionally built to hijack our brain's reward system.
How?
Think about notifications. Likes, shares, comments, they arrive unpredictably. That's like a slot machine's variable reinforcement schedule. You get that little dopamine hit randomly.
Uh-huh.
And it creates this craving loop. You want the next hit, the next distraction, the next tiny bit of validation, no matter how empty it feels later.
And it's not just the addictive design. Screens also amplify isolation in quieter ways, don't they?
Yeah, like losing real eye contact, becoming uncomfortable, just being silent, being still. And maybe withdrawing, because we look at everyone else's perfect-looking online life and assume they're fine, so why bother reaching out?
It's rough.
So this digital loneliness, the source argues, creates this kind of perfect storm. It acts as a powerful, silent, glowing trigger for people who are already vulnerable, maybe because of trauma or mental health issues or just tough life circumstances.
Okay, so we've got the internal pain from trauma. We've got the isolating digital world. Now the source pulls the lens back even further. Looks at the big picture, the systemic level, the weight of the world, or what it calls economic despair.
Right. It argues you just cannot separate the modern addiction crisis from the economic reality many people live in.
Makes sense.
Talks about how, post-industrial economies have changed communities, often hollowing them out, job losses, wages that haven't kept up, the American dream feeling further and further out of reach for so many.
Yeah.
The source uses this phrase. It says this has cracked open, that sense of possibility, leaving behind a gaping hole where hope used to live.
Wow. And you see the impact most clearly in certain places, right? The front lines of the opioid crisis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Places hit hardest by these economic shifts. The Rust Belt, rural Appalachia, marginalized neighborhoods and cities. And the source pushes back really hard against the idea that addiction is rampant there because the people are somehow weaker or flawed.
No, it's there.
Arguing they're suffering because they've been systematically abandoned by economic policy, by social safety nets shrinking.
And that's so important for challenging the old stereotypes of who struggles with addiction. It's not always the person you picture.
Not at all. It could be someone working 2 jobs just to scrape by, someone uninsured, drowning in medical debt, a single parent juggling impossible demands, a teenager watching their family crack under the pressure of rent hikes and no opportunities.
This material really hammers home that despair isn't just a personal failing. It can be structural,
Yeah.
built into the system.
Absolutely. And the source is crystal clear on this. We won't even begin to solve this epidemic until we stop treating addiction only as a problem with a broken person
Mm-hmm.
and start seeing it and addressing it as a symptom of a broken system.
So, looking at that broken system and its fallout, the source describes a pretty terrifying new landscape of addiction today, marked by polyaddiction and these new chemical threats.
Yeah, fentanyl obviously has just completely changed the game.
In what way?
Well, it's 50 to 100 times stronger than heroin. That means it's cheaper, it's everywhere in the supply chain, and it's incredibly lethal,
Yeah.
even tiny amounts. But the source points to something even more horrifying that's making things worse.
Xylazine.
Yeah. The veterinary sedative, tranq, now commonly mixed with fentanyl, and the effects described here are just catastrophic, beyond the overdose risk, which is huge.
What kind of effects?
Users can develop these horrific deep flesh wounds, ulcers, necrosis, leading to amputations. It's tragically earned that nickname, the zombie drug, because of these devastating physical consequences.
Horrifying. But as we've been saying, the source is clear. This isn't just about chemicals anymore. It points specifically to behavioral compulsions hitting young people hard, calls out platforms like TikTok by name.
Right. It argues these platforms are deliberately engineered like slot machines. The endless scroll, the random dopamine hits, the constant instant reward signals. And the consequence, the source suggests, is a generation getting hooked on constant distraction, becoming sort of profoundly detached from their own feelings, their own inner world.
And that's where this idea of polyaddiction becomes so crucial and so complex.
Exactly. It's not just fentanyl or just TikTok. It's the combination. These powerful behavioral hooks converging with chemical dependencies. And the source says you just can't treat them separately anymore. Not effectively.
Which leads directly to the source's really stark conclusion about treatment.
Yes, as the old model, the one focused on treating a single substance addiction, it's dead.
Just doesn't match reality. You can't just detox someone from one thing, tackle that one craving, and think the job is done.
No way.
Yeah.
Because the person struggling today is often dealing with this incredibly complex web of challenges.
Like what?
They might be dependent on multiple things at once. Fentanyl, maybe benzos, maybe alcohol, plus compulsive social media, maybe gambling or sex addiction, nicotine. And on top of that,
Mental health struggles.
huge ones. Complex PTSD from trauma, maybe undiagnosed ADHD, deep grief, all while trying to survive in a world that feels chaotic and offers little support.
So yeah, any treatment program just focused on one substance is, like the source says, dangerously outdated.
Absolutely. What we need, and this material argues for it so powerfully, is an integrated approach. Trauma-informed, holistic, looking at the whole person,
Right.
acknowledging the deep roots, not just trying to patch up the symptoms on the surface.
And the source really doesn't hold back when it talks about the systemic failures that keep this crisis going.
No, it lays them right out. Insurance companies denying the kind and length of care people actually need. Rehab stuck in these old, often ineffective 30-day models that don't touch complex trauma. Prisons crammed with people who needed mental health care, not jail time. Policy just lagging way behind the research and the reality on the ground.
There's that powerful line summarizing it. We punish what we don't understand, and we ignore what we don't want to feel.
Yeah. And the source delivers this really damning indictment. The war on drugs was never meant to heal.
Wow.
It contrasts that whole punitive approach with what's actually needed for healing. Less policing, less jail.
More
Investment in accessible, community-based care. Less shame, less judgment. More truth-telling, building trust, offering real trauma-informed compassion.
Okay, let's circle back to that core theme, connection, but maybe look at it again through the neuroscience lens, based on the source.
Right. It reminds us, fundamentally, humans are wired for connection from birth. Our nervous systems are built to find safety and regulation through relationship, eye contact, a calm voice, touch.
The basics of human bonding.
Exactly. And when those fundamental needs aren't met, maybe through early neglect or abandonment or even chronic loneliness later in life, the brain adapts. It has to.
So instead of wiring for safety through connection,
It gets wired to seek relief through other means. Numbing, escape,
And that, according to the source, is the neuroscience of addiction.
Pretty much. A brain starved of real connection and safety will inevitably reach for anything that offers a temporary escape from that deep pain of disconnection. Whether it's the rush of a drug, the buzz of social media likes, the comfort of food, whatever the compulsion is.
The source mentions a statistic about loneliness that just stops you in your tracks.
Yeah, that chronic loneliness is cited as being as deadly as smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
15 cigarettes, that's huge.
It really underscores that this isn't just a feeling. And the source details other physical impacts of long-term loneliness and disconnection. It can literally affect brain size and function, increase chronic inflammation, flood your system with stress hormones like cortisol, weaken your immune system, even change how your genes are expressed. Disconnection physically harms us.
Which brings us right back to that incredibly powerful line from the source.
Addiction is not the opposite of sobriety. It is the opposite of belonging. So given everything this material lays out, the trauma, the digital isolation, the economic pressures, it ultimately calls for a fundamental shift, a cultural shift in how we even think about this crisis.
Stop the war on drugs.
And start a war on despair.
Yeah.
It challenges all of us, really, to move beyond labeling people struggling with addiction as them, as somehow different, other. And instead, as this bigger collective question, what are we all running from? What is it about the world we've made that's driving so many people to seek escape?
Because, as the source argues, addiction isn't some fringe issue just affecting a few people. It's like a mirror held up to society.
Reflecting what?
Reflecting the loneliness, the disconnection, the crazy demands of overwork, the lack of basic support and security in so many lives.
And the source contends that when we reframe it that way, when we start treating despair and disconnection as a public health crisis, not just a personal problem,
that's when real solutions can emerge.
that's when we can actually start implementing things that get to the root causes.
What kind of things does the source suggest? What do those solutions look like?
Well, it gives examples like really investing in community-level initiatives. Things like community gardens, which sound simple but build connection. Peer-led recovery groups, where shared experience is the medicine.
Yeah.
Pushing for universal access to mental health care. Seriously considering harm reduction, like safe consumption sites. Exploring restorative justice instead of just punishment.
So the goal shifts, right? It's not just managing symptoms after they appear.
No, it's about creating the conditions where healing can happen and maybe preventing some of that despair in the first place.
Which naturally leads to rethinking recovery itself. How does the source imagine that?
It pictures the future of recovery not as isolating people, but as actively integrating them back into healing communities.
So much more than just not using.
Way more. It's about building real-life skills, maybe in supportive, sober living places, engaging in group therapy specifically focused on the trauma, finding healthy ways to process emotions, breathwork, music, storytelling are mentioned, fostering spiritual growth, whatever that means for the person, and above all,
Belonging.
cultivating genuine belonging.
The source sums that up beautifully, doesn't it?
Yeah, connection is the antidote, not just for addiction itself, but for the apathy, the hopelessness, the despair that feed it.
And recovery, framed this way, isn't just about being clean or sober in a vacuum. It's about reclaiming your life step by step within supportive relationships.
So to kind of pull it all together, the core message of this deep dive, based on this source material, it's that the modern addiction crisis is incredibly complex.
Deeply rooted.
Deeply rooted in disconnection, in unresolved trauma, in systemic economic despair. It's presented not just as a chemical issue or a personal failing, but as this profound cultural wound we're all in some way experiencing.
And that shift in perspective, from asking what's wrong with you to compassionately asking what happened to you, it feels like that changes everything.
It's fundamental. And while the source is really blunt about the systemic failures, it also offers this powerful sense of hope, actually.
In what way?
That by understanding these root causes, we actually do have the power to build different systems, to foster communities that actively prioritize connection, that address trauma head-on, that respond to pain with understanding and compassion, not judgment.
So healing is possible, but it needs a collective effort, something much bigger than our old approaches.
Definitely. And maybe here's the final provocative thought to leave you with, drawn right from the source's conclusion. Consider that our collective job now isn't just treating addiction after it shows up.
It's bigger than that.
It's about actively working together to rebuild a world where recovery isn't just this heroic uphill battle fought by a few strong individuals, but maybe a more natural, supported outcome of how we actually live and how we connect with each other every day.